He's 5 of 6 behind the arc.
Oh, got that steal too.
And here he goes.
Here we go.
PG
What you got?
puts
Oh,
on a shot.
yeah!
DeMar DeRozan, 6 to go, got all the way to the bucket.
Paul George and DeMar DeRozan are two of the best wing players the game has to offer right now. And that's what makes this debate on who's the better player all that more interesting. Let's dive deeper into what separates these two guys from one another and try to figure out who's the better player. The first category we always look into is who's the better scorer of the basketball. Let's start with Paul George. George averages 20.4 points over the course of his entire career to this point. His best season with the Oklahoma City Thunder saw him average 28 points per game throughout the entire year. George is certainly one heck of a scorer who doesn't usually waver from his 20-point per game average. Now, as for DeMar DeRozan, he's in a very similar spot. DeRozan averages 20.8 points per game over the course of his career to this point. His best season saw him drop 27.9 points per game in his first year with the Chicago Bulls. So with numbers so close, we're also going to take a look at their career shooting numbers. George shoots 43.5% from the field overall and 38.2% from behind the arc. Plus, we can't forget about his 84.8% shooting from the charity stripe. DeRozan shoots slightly better at 46.5% from the field, but he has a poor 28.8% from three-point range and 83.8% from the free throw line. So this is a ridiculously close battle, but because of those shooting percentages, I'm going to say that George is the better overall scorer. He's far more dangerous from behind the three-point line, he's more efficient on his free throws, and he's taller so he can rise up over his defenders. DeMar is 10 times better when it comes to those mid-range pull-ups, don't get me wrong, but that's not the only thing that goes into making somebody a talented scorer. Now, we can't talk about scoring unless we're also going to dive into the aspect of passing the basketball. Being a good facilitator is a pretty important part of the game, especially when it comes down to two star players on different teams. George averages 3.6 assists per game over the course of his career, with his best passing year coming a few years ago with the Los Angeles Clippers when he dished out 5.7 dimes a game. As for DeMar, he averages 3.9 assists over his entire career, and his best passing season came his final year with the San Antonio Spurs when he averaged 6.9 a game. So when you look at these numbers, it looks pretty clear that DeMar was a tad bit better when it comes to facilitating the offense compared to George. So we think PG might be the better scorer of the basketball, but DeMar can get the ball in the basket while also involving his teammates at a higher level when he starts to focus in on it. Alright, stepping away from the numbers for a second, let's talk about the accolades. Paul George has played 13 years in the NBA, and he's been able to get himself into the postseason 10 times. Out of those 13 years in the league, George has been named an NBA All-Star 7 times. He's made it onto 6 different All-NBA teams, including 1 first-team selection. He also got added onto 2 All-Defensive first teams and 4 All-Defensive teams in general. And if that's not enough, PG also ended 1 season as the steals leader in the league, which is not a very easy thing to do. Now, as for DeMar, he's played 1 season longer in the league compared to George, competing in 14 seasons. Across those years, DeRozan has only been able to make it into 7 playoffs and was named an All-Star 5 times. He's been on an All-NBA team 3 times, but never once got added onto the first team. DeRozan's also never been on an all-defensive team either. So, simply put, Paul George has far more accolades to this point, and it's not even close. He's been an all-star more, he's got more all-NBA additions and first-team spots, plus more all-defensive teams and first-team spots there, and even won the steals crown to top it all off, so this one wasn't really even close. Now, the matchups that we've seen George and DeRozan go head-to-head have been exhilarating. The 2 superstar forwards have competed against one another a total of 37 times, with 7 of them coming in the playoffs and the remaining 30 being in the regular season. During those games, DeMar was the winner of the playoff series by taking it in 7 games. Meanwhile, George has won the regular season matchups, taking 20 compared to DeMar's 17. And where these two really get separated is the numbers that they've put up in these head-to-head matchups. DeMar averages 20.8 points, 4.5 rebounds, 3.3 assists, 1.2 steals, and 0.3 blocks per game. George averages 20.7 points, 7.8 rebounds, 3.6 assists, 1.3 steals, and 0.4 blocks per game. Literally every single one of these categories except for scoring sees George perform a little bit better, and DeMar only holds a 0.1 lead over him in their head-to-head matchups scoring-wise. So once again, we're going to give this category to George to extend his lead over DeRozan in this debate just a little bit further. Now before we move on to this next part of their games, let's show you all some highlights from their careers to give you a little glimpse of what they can do.
Comes George, got the step and stuffs one move and counts in the foul.
Bulls look for the win. DeRozan to win it. Goal!
All right, we've also got to talk about defense, as these are two players who are very opposite when it comes to defense. Paul George is known as a two-way wing, meaning that he has always been great on both sides of the floor. Over the course of his career, George averages 1.7 steals per game, consistently going up against the opposing team's best player. DeMar DeRozan usually isn't set against the opposing team's best player, and he only averages 1 steal a night for his career. While it does in fact seem like George gets scored on an awful lot, especially in the big moments, that doesn't take away from what he's been able to do on the defensive end. PG is more adept at guarding the team's best player compared to DeMar, who's a solid defender in his own right, but just not quite at the level of George just yet. Now, at this point in the video, it might seem like George is just running away with this competition, but hold on, that's not the case. George and DeMar are two very different players when it comes to being clutch. George has not been the clutchest player in the world. In fact, the man has been scored on in big moments more times than I can remember. Seems like every time he needs a stop to ice the game, the opponent knocks down a tough bucket.
Yeah. I mean, that's a bad shot.
As for clutch offensive buckets, we really haven't seen all that much out of him since he left the Indiana Pacers. Meanwhile, DeMar, he's just been clutch bucket after clutch bucket as of late. This past season with the Chicago Bulls saw him sink a handful of game-winning shots as the clock expired. With the recent clutch play we've seen out of these two guys, I'm going to say that DeMar appears to be the more clutch basketball player, at least for the time being. Alright, and finally, we got to talk about leadership. Paul George was the leader of the Pacers for the first half of his career, but that's apparently gone out the window as of late. During his time on the Oklahoma City Thunder, he really didn't step up at all before requesting a trade to go to the Los Angeles Clippers. Since he's been there, he's really kind of taken a backseat to Kawhi Leonard in the offense, and on the defensive end too. You don't often see him being the outspoken leader consistently due to him being a relatively quiet player from what we see during games at least. Now as for DeMar, this guy completely changed how Chicago was playing basketball when he arrived there, and he seemed to be the lifeblood of the group last year. He was also known to drag the Toronto Raptors further than they ever imagined with his leadership to his teammates there. Everybody on that roster bought in with him as the leader, and it helped them finish with the best record in the league multiple times. Neither of these players is known for their leadership being their strongest quality, but nonetheless, I've got to give a very minor edge to DeMar in the leadership area. So, at the end of the day, we come down to the final decision. Who's the better player between Paul George and DeMar DeRozan? Now, judging off the information we've covered here today, I'm going to give the edge to George right now. However, I don't think it's a massive gap between the two because, regardless, these are two star wing players who both of them can elevate their teams. So let us know down below if you think that DeMar is the better player or if you agree with us that George has the edge.